Picture the most powerful navy on Earth. Aircraft carriers, nuclear submarines, warships that had ruled the oceans for 3 centuries and won 2 world wars. Now picture that navy going to war and losing. Not once, not by bad luck. 3 separate times against an enemy that had almost no navy at all. No submarines, no aircraft carriers. A country so small it could barely field a handful of patrol boats, run by a few 100,000 people clinging to a frozen rock in the North Atlantic. And yet, 3 times, that tiny nation forced Great Britain to back down. 3 times, the mightiest sea power in Europe sent its warships north, and 3 times, it sailed home defeated. It is one of the strangest outcomes in modern military history, and almost nobody talks about it. But here is the part that makes it unforgettable. The weapon that beat the British Empire was not a missile. It was not a secret submarine or some clever new gun. The weapon was a fish. An ordinary, cold-water, bottom-feeding fish. The whole thing, 3 confrontations, warships ramming each other in freezing seas, an alliance nearly torn apart, happened over the right to catch that fish. This is the story of the fish Britain went to war over 3 times and lost every single one. To understand how that's even possible, you have to understand what this fish meant. We're talking about cod. Today it's the thing inside your fish and chips, so common it seems almost worthless. But for centuries, cod was not a snack. It was survival. It was money. It was power. In the cold, dark waters of the North Atlantic, cod gathered in numbers so vast that entire nations were built on the backs of these fish. Salted and dried, cod could be stored for years and shipped across oceans. It fed armies. It fed slaves. It fed the poor of Europe through winters that would otherwise have starved them. Wherever the cod swam thickest, ships followed. And no waters on Earth were thicker with cod than the seas around one particular island. That island was Iceland. And for the people who lived there, cod was not just an industry. It was the difference between existence and nothing. Iceland had no forests worth the name, no coal, no oil, no farmland to speak of. What it had was fish. Strip away the cod and the entire country collapses. This was a nation that lived and breathed on what it pulled from the sea, and everyone on that island knew it with total, bone-deep certainty. The ocean around Iceland wasn't scenery. It was the pantry. It was the bank. It was the whole reason a country could survive up there at all. But here was the problem. Iceland was not the only nation with its hooks in those waters. For generations, British trawlers had been steaming north to the same rich fishing grounds, hauling up British cod for British ports. Great fishing towns like Hull and Grimsby, whole cities whose fathers and sons went to sea for that same fish. To Britain, these were the traditional fishing grounds, fished by their grandfathers, and they had no intention of giving them up. 2 nations, 1 fish, 1 patch of freezing ocean. And both of them convinced, right down to their souls, that the cod belonged to them. For a long time it stayed quiet. Then Iceland did something that changed everything. It looked at the sea around its coast, the water it depended on to live, and it drew a line. A new border, not on land, but out across the open ocean. From this line, Iceland declared, these are our waters and our fish, and no foreign boat may cross it. It was a small line at first. It would grow. And every time it grew, it pushed the British trawlers further from the cod they had chased for generations. Now think about what that meant. A country with barely a warship to its name had just told the British Empire to get out of the sea. And Britain, with all its guns, all its history, all its pride, was not about to be ordered around by a speck of a nation in the middle of nowhere. So how does a country with no navy pick a fight with the most powerful fleet in Europe and win? How do you defend a line drawn across the ocean when you have almost nothing to defend it with? The answer is one of the most cunning stories of the 20th century, and it starts with a nation that had absolutely no way to win, staring down the barrel of an empire. Before we go further, subscribe to the channel, because on every episode we take one ordinary thing and uncover the war, the crime, or the secret buried inside it. This is one you'll want to see to the end. To understand why grown men in warships would risk their lives over a fish, you have to go down to the docks of a British city called Hull. For 100 years, this was one of the greatest fishing ports in the world. Before dawn, the quaysides were already alive. The shriek of gulls, the reek of salt and diesel, men in oilskins hauling crates of ice, trawlers packed hull to hull, waiting to steam out into the dark. Whole streets, whole neighborhoods existed for one reason only: the fish. In Hull, and in its sister port of Grimsby, if your father went to sea, you went to sea. It wasn't a choice, it was who you were. And the sea they went to was the far north, the Icelandic grounds. Weeks away across some of the deadliest water on the planet, where waves came like moving walls and ice built up on the rigging until a ship could capsize from its own frozen weight. Men died out there. They died often. But they kept going, because that was where the cod was. Thick, endless, the richest fishing on earth. To the men of Hull, those northern waters weren't foreign. Their grandfathers had fished them, their sons expected to. In their minds it was simple. That was British fish, caught by British hands, sold in British markets. The idea that anyone could tell them to stop was almost offensive. Now sail 800 miles north to the island itself, Iceland. And here is the thing you have to sit with for a moment. This was not a rich country. It was one of the poorest, emptiest places in Europe. No coal, no oil, barely any trees. Farmland so thin and cold you could count the good days of summer on your hands. Fewer people lived on the entire island than in a single London borough. Everything they wore, everything they built, half of everything they ate, it came from somewhere else, bought with money the island did not naturally have. Except for one thing. The sea gave them fish. And the fish gave them everything else. Cod wasn't part of Iceland's economy. Cod was Iceland's economy. Strip it out and there was nothing left. No exports, no income, no way to buy fuel or grain or medicine from the outside world. When Icelanders looked at the cod, they weren't looking at dinner. They were looking at the only thing standing between them and starvation. Every krona the country earned, nearly every job that mattered, came back to that cold, silver fish. So when foreign trawlers came in their hundreds and dragged those grounds year after year, hauling out the cod by the millions of tons, it wasn't just competition. To Iceland, it felt like watching strangers empty your bank account and being told to smile about it. And the fish were not endless. That was the fear that gnawed at every Icelander. The great fishing fleets, British and others too, were pulling out more cod than the sea could replace. The Icelanders could see it in their own catches, in nets that came up lighter than they used to. They understood something the British trawlermen refused to accept. Fish this away hard enough, and one day there is nothing left. And on the day the cod ran out, Iceland didn't just lose an industry. It ceased to exist as a country that could feed itself. This was survival math, and the numbers were terrifying. So now you have the collision, and it was inevitable. 2 nations, 1 fish. One patch of freezing ocean neither of them could live without. For the British, it was pride and tradition, and thousands of jobs in a fleet that had ruled these waters for generations. For the Icelanders, it was something far more absolute. It was existence itself. When one side is fighting for profit and pride, and the other side believes it is fighting for its very life, there is no easy compromise. One of them thinks it can afford to lose, the other knows it cannot. For a while, both sides swallowed it. The British kept coming. The Icelanders kept watching their sea being emptied, grinding their teeth, doing the sums, feeling the fear grow. But a country that believes it is fighting for survival does not stay quiet forever. Something was building on that cold island, a decision that would put a nation of a few 100,000 fishermen directly in the path of the British Empire, because Iceland was done watching. And when this tiny country finally acted, it didn't send a note of complaint or a polite request. It threw down a challenge that struck straight at the heart of everything Britain believed about who ruled the sea. And Britain's answer would not be words. It would be warships. The year was 1958, and Iceland made its move. It announced that the sea belonging to it now stretched 12 miles out from every coast, 3 times further than before. Inside that ring, no foreign boat could fish. To a small country, it was a matter of survival. To Britain, it was an outrage. A tiny nation trying to fence off waters the British had worked for a century. London's answer was blunt. British trawlers would keep fishing exactly where they always had. And to make sure of it, the Royal Navy was going north. Think about the sheer imbalance of what happened next. Britain sent warships, real warships, fast, grey frigates bristling with guns, crewed by professional sailors, backed by the full weight of a global military power. Against them, Iceland had a coast guard, not a navy, a handful of small patrol vessels, lightly armed, some of them barely bigger than the trawlers they were meant to police. On paper, it wasn't even a contest. One side could have blown the other out of the water in an afternoon. Everybody knew it. The British knew it. The Icelanders knew it best of all. And yet, the little Icelandic ships steamed out anyway, straight toward the British fleet, and did something nobody expected. They refused to be afraid. When a British trawler dropped its nets inside the new line, an Icelandic patrol boat would come charging in, sirens screaming, ordering it to stop and leave. When the trawler ignored them, protected now by a warship the size of a building sitting right beside it, the tiny Coast Guard vessel would not turn away. It held its course. And that is when the freezing North Atlantic turned into something close to a battlefield. The tactics were brutal and strange. There were no torpedoes, no broadsides, no declarations of war in any normal sense. Instead, there was ramming. Steel hulls slamming into steel hulls in heaving seas, deliberately, again and again. British frigates would swing across the bows of the little Coast Guard boats to block them, to intimidate them, to push them off the trawlers they were chasing. The Icelanders rammed back. Metal screamed, plates buckled, water crashed over the decks and men clung to railings as ships weighing hundreds of tons crunched together on waves that could kill you in minutes if you fell in. It was a fight measured not in casualties, but in dented hulls and shattered nerves, played out in some of the most dangerous water on the planet, and neither side would back down. For weeks it went on like this. The British thought that sheer presence would settle it. Park enough warships in the fishing grounds, and the Icelanders would eventually give up, go home, accept that they could not win. It seemed obvious. How long could a nation of a few 100,000 people keep chasing an empire's fleet around the freezing sea? How long before the money ran out, the boats broke down, the crews exhausted themselves? Britain settled in and waited for the little country to crack. But the Icelanders didn't crack. They kept coming, day after day, storm after storm, matching the mightiest navy in the region with nothing but stubbornness and a handful of battered patrol boats. And slowly, something began to dawn on the British. Their overwhelming force wasn't overwhelming anything. You cannot sink a country's fishing rights by ramming a trawler. You cannot make a nation surrender its survival by outgunning it, not without firing the shots that would turn a fishing dispute into a real war. And nobody, not even proud Britain, wanted to be the one who opened fire on a tiny ally over a haul of cod. The Icelanders understood this better than anyone. They knew Britain's guns were a bluff it could never truly use. And that is when they began to hunt for something else. Not a bigger gun, not more ships. Something smaller, something clever. Something that could hurt the British without a single casualty and leave them helpless to reply. It was around this time that observers on the British trawlers began to notice something odd. Trailing behind the Icelandic patrol boats, low in the churning water, was a strange piece of equipment none of them recognized. It rode on a long steel cable, cutting through the sea behind the little ships wherever they went. Nobody on the British side knew quite what it was for. It didn't look like a weapon. It didn't look like much of anything. They would find out soon enough. Because that unremarkable object, dragging through the cold Atlantic, was about to do what the entire Royal Navy could not. It was about to bring the British fishing fleet to its knees, quietly, ruthlessly, and without spilling a drop of blood. That strange object, dragging behind the Icelandic patrol boats, had a name: the net cutter. And it was, without exaggeration, one of the most quietly devastating weapons of the 20th century. Not because of what it destroyed, but because of what it made pointless. It was a simple thing. A heavy steel device, shaped almost like a giant pair of shears or a hooked blade, streamed out on a long cable behind the ship and dragged along the bottom of the sea. No engine of its own, no explosives, no moving parts to speak of. It just cut. And that was all it needed to do. To understand why it was so lethal to the British, you have to understand how a trawler makes its money. A trawler doesn't fish with a line, it fishes with an enormous net, a vast bag of mesh dragged along the seabed behind the boat, scooping up everything in its path. That net was the entire operation. It was worth a fortune. Building one, mending one, hauling one full of cod back up from the deep was the whole reason the ship existed. Everything the trawler earned, everything it fed its crew and its home port with, flowed through that one great net trailing behind it in the dark. Now, here is what the Icelanders had figured out. They didn't need to sink the trawler. They didn't need to arrest the crew or fire a single shot. They just needed to get behind it. The Coast Guard vessel would maneuver into position, line itself up with the cable running down to the trawler's net, and drag its cutter straight across it. One pass. The steel blade caught the towing wire, and with a single savage jerk, it sliced clean through. Imagine it from the trawler's deck. One moment you are fishing, your net down in the deep, your hold slowly filling, weeks of dangerous work about to pay off. The next moment there is a sickening lurch, a snap felt through the whole hull, and your net is gone. Just gone. Cut loose and lost to the bottom of the ocean, along with everything inside it. Not damaged, not delayed, destroyed. In a single second, thousands of pounds vanished into the freezing dark, the net, the catch, the entire point of the voyage. And there was nothing you could do. You couldn't get it back. You couldn't fish without it. All you could do was turn your ruined ship around and steam home empty, weeks from port, with nothing to show for any of it. This was the genius of it. The British had brought guns to a fight that could not be won with guns. Their warships could ram, could block, could sit menacingly beside a trawler. But they could not stop a small, fast boat from slipping behind and severing a cable in an instant. And the moment the net was cut, the whole equation collapsed. What was the point of steaming all the way north, risking men's lives in killer seas, if you were just going to lose your net and your catch and go home broke? The cost of fishing those waters suddenly became impossible. Trawler owners did the math and blanched. Every voyage was now a gamble you were likely to lose. And notice what the net cutter never did. It never killed anyone. It never sank a ship. It drew no blood at all. It simply made fishing so ruinous, so pointless, that carrying on wasn't worth it. A nation with almost no military had found a way to defeat a fleet without fighting it. To win a war, by making the enemy's entire reason for being there evaporate. It was economic warfare in its purest form, waged from the deck of a Coast Guard boat with a lump of shaped steel on a wire. The British were furious, and, worse, they were helpless. They could escort the trawlers, they could threaten, they could bluster, but they could not protect a net that was down in the water from a blade dragged silently across it. Every day, more cables snapped. Every day, more trawlers limped home empty. And slowly, the unthinkable settled over the Royal Navy. The most powerful fleet in the region was being humiliated by a device that cost almost nothing, wielded by a country that could barely afford a coast guard. But cutting nets, however clever, could only do so much. It cost Iceland money too. It couldn't drag on forever. And the tiny nation knew that to truly break Britain, it needed more than a blade on a wire. It needed a weapon that struck not at British trawlers, but at Britain itself. Something that would make the whole world lean on London and force the empire to let go. And Iceland had exactly such a weapon. It had nothing to do with fish, or ships, or the sea at all. It sat on a windswept airfield in the middle of the Atlantic, and it was worth more to the west than every cod in the ocean. The weapon on that windswept airfield was a place called Keflavik. And to understand why it terrified the men in London, you have to remember what the world looked like at the time. This was the Cold War. The West and the Soviet Union stood frozen in a standoff that could turn nuclear at any moment, and the entire strategy of the Western Alliance hung on one brutal piece of geography. If war ever came, Soviet submarines and warships would have to break out of the Arctic and into the wider Atlantic to reach America, and to cut Europe off from its lifeline of supplies. And there was one gap they had to pass through to do it. A stretch of ocean between Greenland, Iceland, and Britain. Whoever controlled that gap controlled the North Atlantic. And sitting right in the middle of it, like a cork in the neck of a bottle, was Iceland. That is why Iceland mattered far beyond its size. On that airfield at Keflavik sat a military base, planes, radar, listening posts, the eyes and ears of the Western Alliance watching for Soviet ships slipping south. Without Iceland, the West had a gaping hole in its defenses, exactly where it could least afford one. This tiny, poor, almost defenseless nation held one of the single most strategically vital pieces of ground on the planet. And the Icelanders knew it. They knew that the Alliance needed them far more than they needed the Alliance. That knowledge was worth more than any warship, any gun, any net cutter. It was the ultimate card. And Iceland was about to play it. By the early 1970s, the fight had flared up all over again. Iceland pushed its line further out, this time to 50 miles, and once more the British trawlers refused to leave, and once more the Royal Navy came steaming north to protect them. The pattern repeated. Coast Guard boats darting in, warships trying to shield the fleet, cables snapping, nets vanishing into the deep, trawlers limping home with empty holds and furious crews. The seas boiled with the same grinding, bloodless combat as before. But this time, Iceland reached past all of it, past the ships, past the fishing grounds entirely, and aimed straight at the heart of the Western world. Iceland made a threat so audacious it left London reeling. "Give us our waters," they said, "or we walk out of the Alliance and we close the base. Throw the West's eyes and ears out of the North Atlantic. Hand the Soviets an open door exactly where the free world was weakest." It was breathtaking. A nation of a few 100,000 people, with barely an army to its name, was calmly threatening to blow a hole in the defense of the entire Western Hemisphere. Over fish. And here was the thing. It was not a bluff. Iceland meant it. Losing the cod meant national death anyway, so what did they have to lose by burning the Alliance down with them? Now watch what happened, because this is where the real power moved. The threat didn't just land on London, it landed in Washington. The United States, which cared enormously about that base and not at all about British cod, suddenly found itself staring at a nightmare. A key ally on the verge of collapse, a strategic gap about to open, all because Britain wouldn't stop chasing fish. And so, the most powerful nation on earth turned to its closest friend and, in effect, told it to stand down. The pressure came crashing down on Britain from its own side. London was being crushed not by Iceland's tiny fleet, but by the weight of the entire alliance it belonged to, all of it desperate to keep that little island happy. Britain was cornered. It could keep fighting for its trawlers and risk shattering Western defenses in the middle of the Cold War, dragging America's fury down on its head. Or it could swallow its pride, abandon its fishermen, and let a nation it could have crushed in an afternoon simply have its way. There was no good choice. And so, grinding its teeth, the Empire gave ground once more. It accepted the 50-mile line. The trawlers were pulled back. Iceland had won again, beaten not just by blades on wires, but by a single airfield it dangled over the west like a threat none of them dared call. You would think that would be the end of it. 2 humiliations, 2 retreats, surely now there would be peace. But Iceland had tasted exactly how the game worked. It had learned that its survival mattered less to the world than that patch of ground at Keflavik, and that as long as it held that card, it could push and push and push, and Britain would have to keep giving way. So Iceland did the unthinkable. It went for everything. It drew a new line so vast, so far out to sea, that it dwarfed anything that had come before. A claim so enormous it would ignite the largest and most dangerous confrontation of them all, and drag Britain into one last desperate war it was doomed to lose. The new line Iceland drew was 200 miles. 200 miles of ocean, claimed outright, stretching so far from the coast that it swallowed nearly all the great fishing grounds whole. It was a claim of staggering ambition, and it left the British trawlermen with almost nowhere left to go. This was no longer about 50 miles or 12. This was Iceland saying, "The sea is ours, all of it, and you are finished here." And Britain, backed into a corner one final time, decided it had had enough of retreating. This time, it would fight the whole way. What followed, from 1975 into 1976, was the ugliest and most dangerous chapter of the entire saga. The Royal Navy came north in force, not a few frigates this time, but a serious fleet, sent to physically shield the trawlers from the Coast Guard boats that came slicing at their cables. And the Icelandic captains, who had spent years perfecting the art of the sudden strike, met them head-on. The confrontations turned savage. These were no longer glancing bumps between ships. They were full-speed collisions, deliberate rammings, hulls torn open at the waterline, warships and Coast Guard boats smashing into each other again and again in seas that could freeze a man to death in minutes. Ships were damaged so badly they had to limp back to port for repairs. Others were nearly sunk. On both sides, men were injured, and everyone knew it was only a matter of time before somebody was killed. And then, it very nearly happened. In one of these clashes, an Icelandic vessel fired live rounds, not to sink, but to warn, to prove it would not be pushed. Shots across the water. The line between a fishing quarrel and a real shooting war grew thinner by the day. Iceland arrested British ships. British captains defied Icelandic orders outright. The whole thing was spinning toward a place nobody could control, out on that black freezing water where one bad decision, one collision that went too far, could turn a dispute over cod into dead sailors and a genuine international crisis. Iceland understood it was running out of room, and so it reached for the biggest, most explosive move left to any nation short of war itself. It cut off Britain entirely. It broke off diplomatic relations, a step so serious that between two members of the same alliance, in the middle of the Cold War, it was almost unthinkable. Two allies, two friends, two countries supposedly standing shoulder to shoulder against the Soviet Union, no longer even speaking to each other. Over fish. It sent a shockwave through the West and made the crisis impossible to ignore any longer. The world was now watching a genuine rupture, and the ally sitting on that priceless patch of the North Atlantic was the one who had walked away from the table. For Britain, this was the moment the ground finally gave way beneath its feet. It could keep the warships out there, keep the collisions coming, and watch a fellow alliance member sever ties completely while the seas grew more violent by the week. It could push on toward the day a sailor died and turned a bloodless economic war into something no one could take back. Or it could face the truth it had been dodging for nearly 20 years, that it had already lost. That it lost the moment a tiny nation figured out how to make its own survival more valuable than Britain's pride, and that every ship, every net, every voyage north was now costing far more than any catch could ever be worth. And so, at last, Britain let go. In the summer of 1976, it gave up the fight for good. It accepted the 200-mile limit. It called its warships home from the north and pulled its trawlers out of the waters its people had fished for 100 years. The empire that once ruled a quarter of the planet, that commanded the greatest navy the world had ever seen, was beaten. Not by a rival power, not by a great fleet, but by one of the poorest, smallest, least armed nations in Europe. Iceland had done the impossible. It had gone to war with Britain 3 separate times, and 3 separate times it had won. But this was never really about one stretch of freezing ocean, or one silver fish, or one stubborn little island. Because the moment Iceland won that 200-mile line, it set something loose that could not be stopped. What happened in that cold northern sea did not stay there. It reached across every ocean on Earth and redrew the map of the entire planet, quietly rewriting who owns the sea and who profits from it, right down to this very day. And almost nobody realizes it began with a fight over fish. Here is what almost nobody understands about that fight in the freezing north. When Iceland won its 200 miles, it did not just win a stretch of sea for itself. It cracked open a door that every coastal nation on Earth had been leaning against for decades, and once it swung open, the whole world poured through. For centuries, the rule had been brutally simple. The ocean belonged to no one. Beyond a thin strip of coast, the sea was open to anyone with a ship strong enough to work it, which, in practice, meant it belonged to the powerful. The great navies and the great fishing fleets went wherever they pleased and took whatever they wanted. A small country watching foreigners strip the fish from its own doorstep could do nothing but stand and stare. Iceland shattered that. By fighting 3 times and winning 3 times against one of the mightiest nations on the planet, it proved something explosive, that a small country could claim a vast reach of ocean as its own and actually make the claim stick, even against an empire. And the moment that was proven, everyone wanted in. Nations all around the world looked at what Iceland had done and thought, if they can do it, so can we. The pressure became unstoppable, and in 1982 it was written into international law for good. 200 nautical miles. Every coastal country on Earth granted the exclusive right to the resources of the sea reaching 200 miles out from its shores, the fish, and everything beneath the waterline too. The oil, the gas, the minerals, all of it. Think about the scale of that. In a single stroke, enormous portions of the world's oceans stopped being open water and became national property. Regions that had been a free-for-all for the whole of human history were suddenly carved up and handed to the countries beside them. It is one of the largest transfers of control over the planet's surface that has ever happened. And it happened not through some grand war between superpowers, but because a tiny island of fishermen refused to back down over cod. The map of the sea that governs the world today, the invisible lines that decide who drills for oil where and whose navy patrols which waters, was drawn in the wake of that fight in the North Atlantic. And the winners were exactly the kind of nations that had spent centuries being pushed around. The small ones, the poor ones, the ones with a long coast and no great fleet. Iceland handed them a weapon that no gunboat could take away. It changed the balance of power on a quarter of the planet's surface, quietly, in favor of the little countries the big ones had always ignored. But every victory has its bill, and someone always pays it. In Britain, the price fell on the fishing towns of the north, places like Hull and Grimsby, cities that had lived and breathed the northern cod for generations. When the trawlers came home for the last time and never went back out, those towns did not just lose a job, they lost their reason for being. Whole fleets rotted at the docks. Thousands upon thousands of men who had known nothing but the sea were thrown ashore with no work and no future, in ports that had been built around a trade that no longer existed. Communities that had sent their sons north for 100 years watched it all collapse in a matter of years. To this day, those towns carry the scar. They were the human cost of an empire that fought a war it could not win, over waters it was never going to keep. And that is the truth hiding underneath this whole story. It was never really about fish. The cod was just the thing you could see. Underneath it was something far bigger, the question of who owns the sea, who profits from what lies beneath it, and whether a small nation has the right to say no to a powerful one. A country that most of the world could barely find on a map took on an empire 3 times, won every round, and in doing so, quietly rewrote the rules for everyone. The next time you look at a map of the oceans and see those clean lines slicing the water into national zones, remember where the first crack appeared. It appeared in the freezing waters off a tiny island, in a war fought with net cutters and stubbornness, over a fish. The world is full of these stories, the small, forgotten fights that quietly reshaped everything, hiding in plain sight behind something as ordinary as a fish on a plate. If you want more of the hidden history buried inside the everyday things around you, subscribe to the channel and stay with us. Because the next one begins with something even smaller, and it changed the world just as much.